So first things first, then, congratulations on a heck of a career. You got what, 3 weeks left? Something like that, 4?
Something like that. They've shifted the date around a bit. March 31 will now be my last day at the International Monetary Fund, and then that'll cap. So it's scary to think about it. 40 years and working for the central banks and the IMF combined. I've been around.
I was gonna say, catch me up on your background was Bank of Canada, then IMF, and now you're the resident expert of central bank digital currencies at the IMF. Is that sort of the way
That's essentially what's happened. And then after that, who knows? I plan to stay in the business, though.
I would expect you should, just as a, if not consulting, simply humanity kind of is going to need it, because what people don't understand is the accumulated knowledge it takes to navigate all of this, the complexity of legal and policy with institutions, with the tech. It's incredibly tough to maintain all of that state and write it all down so that like the next generation understands it.
Yeah, and it's changing all the time, because you recall that we published a working paper that was last year, June or so, which was supposed to address the complexity of the CBDC decision-making process. Well, guess what? We're in the process right now of rewriting that, because we've learned a lot. We're, in fact, one of the things we do at the IMF is what we call technical assistance, and that's where a member country comes to us and says, "Hey, we'd like to think about issuing a CBDC. So can you help us through that process?" And we say, "Sure." And with most of the things we do in this technical assistance realm, someone comes along and says, "We want to improve or build out our RTGS system, introduce fast payments and so on." We've got armies of people within and without that we can, and it's well documented, it's well established. And in this case, we're just kind of flying by the seat of our pants in a sense, with some knowledge that we've gathered through all the work we did prior to that paper and so on. But we're finding that once we get our teeth into it, some of the things we said in that paper are really they might be right, but they need to be added to or improved. Messages need to be bolstered, and there's research coming online that's changing some of the assumptions that we've made.
It's interesting. I remember talking to you about that paper before it went out, and I was coming from the political realm of like, you have to map in the legal framework before you move forward. And now, to your point, like I think we're seeing Bahamas like, okay, well, maybe that's really the way to go if you want to scale it and not have to backfill, right?
Yeah. And in their case, they had little choice. The islands had been devastated by the hurricane, and they needed to quickly move their project along. And that's not best practice. We would still say that best practice would be, it's say a 2-year process, and you plod through a lot of groundwork, research, making sure they understand the impact it might have on the financial sector, make sure you've got the capacity, legal, regulatory, cybersecurity, and then move along in a very, very structured way. But in this case, they really had no choice. They had to roll it out very quickly.
Yeah, well, look, they seem incredibly competent, so I'm sure they're going to get there.
Yeah, we get a little bit of help in the background. We published we have this publication called Finance and Development. So we published something last week, an edition that covered the digital economy, and so talked there about the role that we played in the background. That wasn't a formal engagement for us in the sense that it was technical assistance. Technical assistance is a whole different beast. It's almost like a contractual relationship where they say, "This is what we would like you to do," and we say, "This is what we will do," and then we do it. In this case, it was just sort of help on the margins, basically.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, we say, for those who don't know the IMF, that the technical assistant program of all the central banks that want to do, like you said, here's a real-time payment system. You guys know how to do that in spades. As soon as you get into central bank digital currencies, they're either calling folks like me, or they're calling guys like IMF going like, help us design it. And by the way, who are the handful of companies that actually know how to implement this?
Yeah.
And it's
quite a community out there. now too. I mean, some people have the assumption that there's a dominant few firms, for instance, that run the structure, the structure that runs underneath potential CBDC. But I keep this little list, and I'm planning someday to build it out into like a sort of a map by type of vendor and so on. And it's really quite a rich ecosystem now. You know, Everest is one of them, and there's plenty of others. But you know, if you listen to the vibes in social media and so on, you think it's all about Ethereum, and it's about XRP, and everybody else is really you know, there's nobody else in that community, but it's a big community.
It really is. I'm going to say, I'll show you a little bit of what we've been doing relative to the best model I've seen come out is actually one of your cohorts there at Bank of International Settlements, of talking about hybrid versus direct, right? Access versus tokenization, retail and wholesale. Like that whole model, you can start, to your point, mapping out like who's doing what where, how do they help? Are you know, like been talking with some of your colleagues there about, you know, they want to do wholesale. It's like wholesale is pretty easy. There's like a dozen guys who can do that. You want to do retail, and then you want to do retail, and then you want to do, how are you going to do user privacy, do a 2-tier where the banks are actually doing it, but still, if you'll come up a layer to the central bank or the financial intelligence units, like then you start getting into a smaller class of folks who can actually implement that. But you're right.
And you're right about that, because the wholesale CBDC, people often say, why aren't you that interested in wholesale CBDC? First of all, the financial infrastructure is not my main thing. So and we have people that work on financial market infrastructure issues, and in that sense, that's where the wholesale CBDC fits. And it's maybe it's also for me not as interesting, because there's all those moving parts you mentioned that you face with the retail. Wholesale is pretty simple because it's a super closed ecosystem. It's going to be just the members of the payment and settlement system, and all you're doing is replacing some of the plumbing. In the case of retail, you're changing everything.
Everything. Thank you. So like wholesale, everyone's like, can you do a wholesale? I was like, probably we could do that like 2 years ago. By the way, it's not that hard. Like it's just, you know, retail. I mean, one of the pieces I learned talking with, again, some of your colleagues during Q4 was the identity verification, and how the central banks really want to push that down to the intermediaries. They just don't want to be responsible for it. And then how do you do that where you still have user privacy, yet disclosure at this, I call it privacy with transparency at the same time. So you don't have a full surveillance state. Like that, to your point, like that's complicated, intricate, and really interesting. Like you can do it, but it's hard. Like it's a complicated problem. So
it's hard on the sort of the conceptual level, and it's also challenging on the technical level too. I mean, there's different ways you can run. That's why I'm fascinated by this ecosystem of different vendors out there and different models and so on. You've got everything from the old-fashioned sort of centralized system where it runs just like bank accounts and credit cards and debit cards do now, to then you can move on to the ones that run distributed ledger technology, and then you move on to some are now working on models where it's none of those things. It's essentially like trading strings of bits from one device to another, period, with no ledger, no surveillance, or anything.
Yeah, the tokenization, and I don't mean tokenization as in what the crypto guys are thinking of, like how Visa refers to tokenization of the transaction. That's interesting. Again, like I'll show you, like we can do that piece. We didn't start there though. We started with an account-based solution because it opens up everything else in the world as opposed to just the transaction. But I have to share with you a quick story just on how you and I met almost 2 years ago, because it's still
through Sonia, right? Yeah,
through Sonia.
Via Sonia.
And
Sonia, yeah.
It was right around when Libra came out, right?
Yeah.
And so I was, if you will, on vacation with my kids in upstate New York, and right, we were a little startup at the time, and Libra comes out with their thing, and I remember having, like, it was July 4th weekend. You're like, Bob, I'm writing this, you know, part of the opinion for G7 on this. can you what do you think about these couple of things? And it was an odd thing. Like, it was like, well, kids, like, I know it's a little startup we're doing, but the IMF actually wants my opinion on Libra and how they're going to, got a money laundering hole, they got a governance hole, they got a, oh gosh, you were the one that pointed out the taxation on the token itself, and the fact that they'd probably take G100 to 200 central banks and take all sovereignty away from them. I was like, so to this day, my kids still tease me. They're like, so Dad, you help G7 write an opinion again? Like, no. But anyway, that was a fun exercise.
Yeah.
And they're coming along, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, they claim that they may be launching imminently, and then the aspirations have changed. And we were talking about it. First of all, remember, it was going to be the universal token that was going to rule the world. It was going to be multi-currency modeled, kind of on the SDR, which with SDR minus the renminbi, and then right away all the central banks and regulators just piled on them, so they've kind of gradually scaled it down. Now we're now a US dollar only token with a limited rollout, but I think they basically have to wait for the Swiss regulator FINMA to rule on it, because that's where they decide to make their home base.
Yeah, we just say I don't know. I was talking to all the regulators at the time, going through our regulatory approval, and I knew like they were dead beat. They couldn't get that thing through. Like the regulators like, yeah, no way. And if you'll notice, their scaled back version looks a heck of a lot like us. And we have our in principle license now, so we're going through the final steps. So it'll be interesting to see how they. Well, I think they're, like I said, their new incarnation looks a whole lot like ours, right? That you have to have closed wallet systems so you can at least track who's doing what, and you don't let money laundering go all over the world. But they'll get there.
Yeah. I mean, their advantages that they're inside the Facebook ecosystem. That's going to be the interesting wrinkle here.
Yeah, so like when you can turn on 75% of 2 to 3 billion people, that's going to be instant payments. It's going to be really interesting.
Yeah. But the other, it also goes back to what we were saying before, how all of these, we're talking about pandemic and how that's changed everything. And I think Libra is another one of those big moments too, because it's focused attention on digital currency, stable coins, and so on.
Yeah, I agree. Like, again, it's as a much smaller company than Facebook, I actually think they were not ambitious enough, to be honest. I mean, like, they're going to change the world with the way they're going to do it. But it's really just payments. They didn't get to identity, right? They didn't. From there, you can't vote. You can't do supply chain. You can't do, if you will, health, all these other things. And it's because they missed the identity piece altogether. So I think they're, like I said, I think they're going to do wonderful on payments. We could probably move the whole world forward a little bit along with us. But they're still can't do these other things yet. And they could have. So.
Yeah. They tried to come up with that big bang, and that was not the right way to do it.
I got to tell you, like, I've gone back and forth with a lot of these guys because I know a bunch of those guys. And it was like their hand got forced. I want to give them the benefit of the doubt on, like, okay, it got public faster than they wanted it to. So like the governance was not baked, the AML hole was not baked, the data privacy was not, like, I can forgive them those three things. The token is, I think, irresponsible. And which is why I'm glad they were, Maxine Waters and everyone beat them back on that. I mean, I spent enough time out there in G100 to 200 where, like, you take 70-80% of a market on payments, you just neutered a central bank. They can't get debt. They can't, how are you going to pay for the hospitals and the vaccines? And like people die. And it's like, that's just Facebook being Facebook, right? Like, that's just like, that's careless, and people like you just can't do that. That's bad.
Yeah, it sort of reminds me of how the official sector, say the G10 level, how they think about the financial stability implications of things like Libra or just crypto assets in general. And some of us at the fund were chatting about this, that, if you read the official pronouncements from the Financial Stability Board, we will say that crypto assets, stable coins, are currently not a systemically important financial stability risk, et cetera, et cetera. That's true when you're wearing your global hat and you're thinking, okay, is it going to bring down the US or the European financial system? Not too likely. But, if you're a very small country, little island or something like that, it's huge. It could be potentially huge. You have Libra or DM, as they call it now, suddenly coming down your head and then undermining your monetary policy sovereignty.
Yeah,
that's a big deal.
Big deal. I would say, like, I just eyeballed. I was like, they'd take Fiji, it's almost 1 million people, in probably 6 to 8 weeks, and they'd take 80% of the flow, like literally user to merchant. Like, okay, you just took the power away from the central bank to do anything. And, like, by the way, like, I'm not even opposed to that, so long as, like, let's discuss it. Let's have a transition. Let's go ahead and figure out a way so that hospitals get built and roads, and you don't kill people.
Yeah, no, of course, the IMF were very heavily involved in all those efforts with the Financial Stability Board and the CPMI and so on. And there's we've got a very public and visible process by which we're chopping through all these different components of the issue.
I got to tell you, that's good to hear. I say, like, I've been seeing some of the results of your guys' discussions as it filters its way through, like, ECB, and then eventually gets into MICA regulation. MICA is almost 99% cut and paste from the Maltese, who started.
MICA being what? You've got me there.
Oh, that's the European crypto asset regulation, like the bit license kind of stuff that New York's doing.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, anyway, like, the way they think about it, if you will, that's the regulation side. And then ECB came out recently of, like, how are we going to deal with stable coins, right? Because to your point, like, stable coins at scale will start going, like, you'll hit Spanish mortgages, for example, right? You'll hit the credit markets. And so, as we've been discussing it in Europe with some of our regulatory counterparts, like, we program fiat. That's really the extent of our stable coin. And so anything we program, you still have to have, if you will, real euros behind it. And therefore we don't disrupt that, if you disrupt the entire market or the financial system. I think if we, by doing, again, these were design choices we made, I think that leads to an elegant transition towards what I would call a user-centric model. And you don't have to just rip out, say euros are no longer valid here. That's just not going to work. So
yeah. So where are you active these days? Which countries can you say?
Yeah, I can. We actually did a whole bunch in the last 3 years, I would say, proving out each component of our system, right? So it was like, we did KYC, right? Then we did biometric identity. The Indonesians, we showed end to end, right? Which was like, here's your stable coin that's programmed only for a gas tank, send it to people's faces, right? We integrated with BRI, so we could do a full end-to-end loop of user going to an intermediary. The intermediary was then collecting digital assets, our programmable stable coin. We were processing that across our ledger and then actually sending fiat back, like the whole end to end. So now that we've sort of proven each element out, we actually are reconfiguring it all for direct to consumer. And the direct to consumer comes with fiat on and off. Europe, US, Australia, Philippines, Mexico, Indonesia, and adding about 5 more here in 2021. So it'll look a little bit like, here's Coinbase for the rest of the planet.
Okay.
So that's where we're headed. We'll still work with, large partners that bring the users on board. So we work with banks in South Asia where they're like, hey, we just want you to do eKYC for us and create accounts for folks. We're like, sure, we'll do that. By the way, they're going to get all of our services too. They're going to get crypto, they're going to get cross-border, they're going to get invest in stocks or crypto, they get all of it. But
you can plug any of those components though into somebody else's system. Like let's just say, for example, Algorand's running a system. You could plug your KYC into their model, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, let me show you. Let me do I'll share with you some screens. It'll answer your question.
Yeah, that looks familiar. That's from the BIS paper, right?
That's the BIS paper.
Yeah.
When I saw this, he was like, oh goodness, guys, like you nailed it. Like this is the design choice, right? Like this is how you actually go about building one. And so what I did is I actually mapped in like, oh, here's our solution. We can do a hybrid or direct on the architecture. Infrastructure, we're using DLT and a conventional. Access, we're doing account-based, but like I said, we can do a tokenized transaction also. And then wholesale and retail with cross-border, right? And so it makes it pretty flexible for just about any central bank looking at this kind of thing. Now, to answer your question on like, here's how we look at it, how we plug into other folks, right? We have our ID token, which is basically access, right? And then we have this roll-up bridge. And there's multiple roll-up bridges. So we're bridging to Ethereum mainnet now, and we've got a couple of others coming. And what that does is it lets you literally share tokens and information, and by the way, convert fiat into whatever through this bridge. So as soon as you can convert all of that in and out of our ecosystem, you're like, okay, we've got our biometrics and KYC and all the identity piece. We've got our wallet. Again, one of our really, I don't know if you remember this, one of our differentiating factors is you don't even need a device, right? Like we had folks in Indonesia just coming up to BRI bank agents. We have our stable coin, which can be a programmed CBDC. And then organizational identities and wallets. And so it's like, oh, you can do anything you want inside of this system. You can program in the privacy of the user if you want, right? Depending on the legal system. And it all can process in and out. So yeah, we can plug into other systems too.
Good, yeah.
So here's one. I mean, generally, how does that look like technically? It's like, okay, here's all the identities with different credentials attached to it. And it comes into what we call an identity chain on one side. And we have a transactions 2 chains on the other side. Now for CBDC, we looked at, you can do 2-tier, or we can go direct too, but the 2-tier seems to be everyone's doing that. No central bank's going to be like, we're now the bank for everybody.
That's right. I mean, we racked our brains actually when we were writing that paper. What could we find an example of someone who is or should be thinking about a single tier? It just doesn't. We could only think maybe there's some countries where the financial sector is so underdeveloped that there's no hope of anybody to share this load with. But we couldn't think of anybody off the top of our heads.
John, I mean, like I said, I'm spending a bunch of time in emerging markets, countries with like 200,000 people. And even there, it's like you still have 3 or 4 commercial banks and they run the place generally. It works for everybody. And by the way, they put the politicians in office. So the idea that a central bank is going to come in and be like, yeah, you're out of business just doesn't seem to be a reality.
Yeah, and not only banks, but most will have some fintech type sector out there, or certainly somebody can step in and take that role on anytime.
Yeah, and we're seeing actually like I put a bank and a payment and any intermediary. We've been having some interesting discussions in the Middle East where the banking sector, to your point, is pretty weak, but the payment sector is actually very strong and fills the role, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, like we looked at like, oh, we can drop in our, we call it a gateway with DLT, right? And it literally can feed straight up to what I call, there's your DLT plus database doing hundreds of thousands of transactions a second. But really all it's doing is it's doing a view of what the intermediaries are doing, the banks, the payments, and the other ones are doing. And so long as those are synchronized, which at this speed you can, you end up with real-time gross settlements with a central bank digital currency that in our solution literally can go cross-border, right?
Yeah.
So again, if you remember what we do with account-based, anyone with a mobile app or web, you do your liveness, biometrics, map it to, as I put it, you know, your passport, match my photo with this, check the document, make sure it's all valid. And then we create this core. And what we did is we made it so that literally Everest itself can't see the data, only the user can. It's like a infrastructure that the user owns. And the only way to get in is their biometrics and PIN and stuff. But then we attached it to an account. And like I mentioned, we're doing all the ins and outs around the world now. So if you can go ACH or SEPA into this, and then do PesoNet in the Philippines, you're doing real-time cross-border compliantly in a couple of minutes.
Okay.
So,
all right, quite the ecosystem.
What's that?
It's quite the ecosystem you have there.
Yeah, it's a bunch of, you know, it's a bunch of accounts around the world that map into our stable coin, right? And that's programmable fiat. And so what we found is the way we architected our stable coin is we don't need a license everywhere we go, right? We needed that one license in Europe, but after that, we show up in that flow I just showed you of the ins and outs. We look like a gift card company to everybody else in the world.
So let's say in the US, I mean, it's notorious for its very complex regulatory system. So you wouldn't have to have a state specific, or then each state have a money transmitter license.
Correct. We don't need 50 MSB licenses. We literally need a bank account like a merchant, and a merchant for gift cards, because we're issuing and redeeming our own stable coin that's programmed with integrated KYC.
Okay.
Yeah, and so we say I was pleasantly surprised, and then did it in Latin America, and then did it in Asia, and then did it in Oceania. It was like, okay, like every country has more or less the same guidelines on flow of funds and what you need. And so, yeah, like for us, we just simply have to go get merchant accounts around the world.
Yeah.
So I'll show you one more and chat some more, but again, you know, our heritage of coming from identity, like we started there, right? And if you don't, you end up making that Libra mistake. Let's do transactions. You forgot to do the identity. So it's like, okay, well, here's KYC and identity. But from that, you can do multiple wallets. So as you were saying, like, how do you plug in a bank wallet or a remittance wallet or somebody else's wallet? All of those wallets still have one identity verified human being underneath all that, right? And so we can support multiple wallets because it has an identity underneath.
Yeah.
Then the next piece we did is in our transactions, and this is a little bit how we met with Sonia. And sorry for the eye chart there. We took the regulations from Australia, Austrac, And we mapped them all into if-then statements of smart contracts. So that it was like, oh, 7th transaction from Bob going to the Philippines for $9,900 this month. Like, does that throw a flag or not? And so ultimately, we just started mapping the law into code so that any transaction that gets done is compliant, automated, like has to be. And anything that's a little bit not compliant, well, throw the flag, do suspicious transaction report, or have our MLRO take a look. But this type of, architectural means that anybody can come in with a wallet, right? And you still end up with cross-border retail, compliant, and you have, I said the identity underneath is and no AML hole is the key there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I say now we're going out and signing up wallet folks all over the world to actually just come in on top because it's already plumbed to be licensed and regulatory approved. So
okay.
Yeah.
So you come a long way since we first talked. That's for sure.
Yeah, it's very. Everyone's like, "Where's the app, Bob?" And I was like, "Guys, it's not an app. Like this is, this took 3 years of like testing every single piece out." You say, "Well, where are you seeing the market go these days in terms of CBDCs, and what's going to be next?"
Yeah, well, you may know, you've probably seen my personal website where I keep my tabulation of CBDC, and I remember we started that one in November 2019. We published a paper that was kind of a 20,000 foot paper on CBDC, and so I think there were about 10 countries in there we identified. Now my list is up to about 50 something, and that's consistent somewhat with the BIS survey. They run a survey every year, and so they I think they say 80% of the 60 banks they survey are kicking the tires of CBDC. So it's roughly consistent with that. And I like to tell people that everyone's focused on what's China doing and what about the digital dollar, digital euro, but the real action is taking place in the other 150 or so countries. That's I think they have in some ways have the cleanest potential use case for CBDC. You have to wonder sometimes with the advanced countries, like, you're kind of stretching it here, and it's good to look at it in a contingent basis. That's what Bank of Canada says, for instance. They're not going to launch necessarily, but they want to be ready if cash usage drops off dramatically and so on. But there's many smaller countries, I think, that have a more compelling use case on a financial inclusion basis, or even just the cost of managing physical cash basis. At the same time, we also we like to play the part of the party pooper at the IMF too, that don't rush into it. I mean, even though we said that the Bahamas did it rather quickly, they've been working on that for some time. So it wasn't something they woke up one morning and said, "Hey, we're going to issue CBDC." And so, in some cases, we fear a little bit that there's vendors like yourself that are out there convincing central banks to jump in before they're ready. And there's all these sort of, not just technical issues that they need to consider, but financial stability, monetary policy, and so on. And they need to look at other alternatives, because it could be that in some cases, the problem that they're trying to solve, CBDC is not the best way to go. If you don't have a good, robust payment system, a core payment system, maybe that's where you got to start. And so that's kind of our party pooper role. And if we get past that, and then they say, well, we all agree that this is a good idea, let's now start taking a look at CBDC as a whole process that we coach them through proof of concepts and trying different design features, doing focus groups, surveying users, because it's essential that you include all stakeholders in this process, and then through to a pilot. And then if that's successful, then perhaps you launch.
It's funny. I tell you, like, I'm a bit of the party pooper in the blockchain space. If everyone's like, you should apply blockchain to everything. And I was like, no, there's like 3 to 5 applications where it actually solves problems that were not solvable before. The
Yeah.
rest of it, no. And to echo
Yeah,
yours,
one of our mantras is that the technology choice is actually the last one you make.
yeah,
You don't start with saying, how can I apply blockchain to this problem? That's at the end of it all. You say, okay, now I know what I want to do, what I want to achieve. Now is the blockchain the right way to go? Well, I should look at the other ones too. This, maybe blockchain is not the way to go.
I totally agree. You say like is remember some of our discussions about a year ago is like the idea of permissionless blockchains for a set, like that's a non-starter for these guys. Like that's never going to work, right? And to your point, like, even I find myself going like, guys, like I don't want to go spend a year of my engineering time to go build something you guys aren't going to use or doesn't actually solve real problems. And so we've gotten to the point where it's like, like we start with the political will, right? We've learned, like, by the way, it can't even be a ministry. It literally has to be vice president level or CB central bank level that has the authority to push this down. Political will. Then you go legal, right? You have the legal, like, what do you really like? Can you actually map in the legal constructs of what you want to do? And then identity, right? After that, you get into the payments and what, the rest of it goes. But if you don't go kind of in that order, we're seeing, a few Latin American countries like, I just want to rush in. I want to do real-time, payment system. You're like, okay, knock yourself out, do that. Come back to us when you want to do a real comprehensive, like, as I put it, like, you want to do Estonia or India stack architecture to really propel your whole economy for the next decade, like that's us. If you just want to do real-time payment, like there's some real-time payment guys out there that do that. But
Yeah.
I'm with you, like it has to be thoughtful.
Yeah. So our challenge going forward, I think, is going to be the IMF. That is that we have the capacity to help all these countries, and we fear that if we're outstripped on that basis, that there may be cases of countries just tearing ahead before they're really ready, and that's one of my biggest fears.
Yeah, well, I know we've chatted a little bit, like we're talking to a few central banks that aren't talking to this IMF about their central bank digital currency aspirations. And I was like, look, my team and I are pretty good at this, but the IMF has been doing this since 1950.
Yeah.
Let's go ahead and bring in guys that will help, when it's all done, it's thought through. It maps into literally what G20 is going to think is okay. Like, let's get that input now. So I hope as we do our progression and you guys do yours, we can continue to collaborate and make sure people do the right things.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.